Thank you very much, Jane. It's so lovely to see so many people here. So welcome to Heriot-Watt University. We are a community of some 166,000 alumni, 27,000 current full-time students from 157 countries, from our campus bases in Malaysia, UAE, and here in Scotland, and some 40,000 part-time students learning remotely from home or work. So we're a place with a heritage that welcomes conversations about faith and belief. And that's because it's important to our students and important to our staff. As a charitable body, we exist to educate people, to do research, and to translate our knowledge for the benefit of society. And actually, we're a place that puts an emphasis on personal development of our community as much as upon their intellectual development. I don't know what you feel, but some of the most majestic and mysterious aspects of our existence somehow are the things we spend least time reflecting on. And these are things of great importance and significance to our life and death as humans. God has given humans a great curiosity to understand who they are, where they're from, how they work, and why. And tonight is an opportunity for such reflection upon ourselves. Now, I remember that 2 years ago, we gazed into the stars and galaxies and the edge of the universe when we had a lecture from Brother Guy, Consul Magno, director of the Vatican Observatory. And last year with John Watt, we looked at the very nature of what a human is, and if it's possible to have a perfect human assisted by robots and AI. And of course, the way that we perceive our world determines what we think about it and how we shape it. And today, we're going to have the opportunity to reflect on ourselves, but of course, thinking about our brain, our very being, the very being that is connecting with us all right now. And it's this humanness that makes us, it defines us, and it defines our world. So I hope that tonight you will gain personal benefit as we contemplate during this time together. And just finally, welcome to Heriot-Watt University, a place that is intent on shaping a human future. Welcome.
So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Sharon Dirckx, who is our guest lecturer this evening. Now, Sharon studied biochemistry at the University of Bristol, and it was in her student years that she came to faith and belief in Jesus Christ. She stayed interested in science, as is evident from what she's doing tonight for us. She carried on to do her PhD in functional MRI. To you and me, maybe that's brain imaging. She did that at the University of Cambridge. Then she went on to do postdoctoral research at the Medical College of Wisconsin and also back in the UK at Oxford University this time. And then for the last 15 years, she has been a speaker, an author, broadcaster. She's published 3 books, one called Why, looking at God, evil, and personal suffering. The one that I read and thought, oh, this would be a very interesting subject for an annual lecture, was Am I Just My Brain? I'm really hoping the answer's no to that from me and Lee. And then thirdly, a book that was longlisted for Science and Religion Award just last year, Broken Planet, about natural disasters. So you can see from that Sharon is not scared to take on the big topics of faith and life. She's a regular contributor on national radio, she's also been on television, and has written for The Times. And in the midst of all of that, she is wife to Conrad and mum to 2 teenagers. And we're delighted, Sharon, that you have given time to come to Heriot-Watt University this weekend, and especially tonight to continue what is now quite a long tradition of the annual chaplaincy public lecture that looks at issues of science and faith. And we're very intrigued to hear what you have to share with us. So let's welcome Dr. Dirckx.
Thank you so much, Reverend Howard and Principal Williams, for those introductions. Thank you all for coming this evening. I'm sure there are many other things you could be doing on a Monday evening, but thank you for choosing to be here to think about the question, are humans unique? What does it mean to be human? And we're thinking about this question all the time in light of current affairs, in light of technological developments. And so we're going to look at this question again tonight through the lens of neuroscience and through philosophy and also theology. Of course, many different answers to this question exist, and our beliefs on whether or not humans are indeed unique depends on what we think a human being actually is. And people believe all kinds of different things. What exactly are we? Are we just advanced apes? Are we souls that are trapped in a body and that one day will float off to some higher existence? Are we machines that one day will be superseded? Will this annual lecture one day be given by ChatGPT? And perhaps ChatGPT even tonight could have given you a much better version of this lecture. I'm not sure if it's a good thing or not that I didn't consult ChatGPT for the content, but that is the case. Now, anthropologists point out that there are a number of human features that differ even from our closest genetic relatives, the chimpanzee. We could name many things, but for example, we are bipedal, we stand upright, and what that means is our hands are free to use for other things. We have opposable thumbs. Our thumbs are longer than our closest relatives, making it possible for us to hold tools and exercise fine motor control, which has meant all kinds of other things came from that. And we have the capacity for language to communicate to a greater depth than other species. There are many differences even between us and our closest genetic relatives. But the question is, does that count for anything substantial? Well, there are some scientific voices that believe that there is nothing unique about human beings. For example, Charles Darwin, in his work, The Descent of Man, said that the difference in mind between man and the higher animals, great as it is, certainly is one of degree and not of kind. And that there is no fundamental difference between man and the higher mammals in their mental faculties. So that's Charles Darwin. Or we could look at a more recent perspective from Francis Crick, famous for co-discovering the DNA double helix along with James Watson. Well, he wrote later on in what was known as his astonishing hypothesis in 1994 that humans in their entirety are nothing but a pack of neurons. Well, is this the best story that can be told about human uniqueness? Now, arguably, the quality that distinguishes us most from other creatures is that we are conscious beings. We do extraordinary things like create poetry and write philosophy and invent technology. We dance, we sing, we laugh. We fall in love, we grieve the loss of loved ones, we tell stories, we contemplate our existence. And though a small number of other species may do one or two of these things, no other species is doing all of them. René Descartes, the philosopher, said that the aspect of humanity that we know with most certainty is that we are conscious beings. Cogito, ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. We have a sense of self, a point of view. Part of my own story is of sitting as a child, or I don't know, around the age of 10 or 11, slightly bored on a rainy day, of which there are many in the UK, looking out of the window, and suddenly a series of questions came to me, seemingly from nowhere. I wasn't raised in a religious home. I wasn't thinking particularly deep thoughts. It's as though these questions came to me. Why can I think? Why do I exist? Why am I a living, breathing, conscious being? I had an awareness of my own existence, of my own consciousness. As the philosopher Thomas Nagel said, there is something that it is like to be you. And it seems that that makes us unique amongst all other creatures. So another perspective in this conversation is to say that humans are unique, but that's all because of their superior brains. Nick Bostrom, a philosophy professor and director of the Future of Humanity Institute in Oxford until last year, said, inside your cranium is the thing that does the reading. This thing, the human brain, has some capabilities that the brains of other animals lack, and it is to these distinctive capabilities that we owe our dominant position on the planet. So this view says, yes, we are unique, but it's all because of the brain. Now, it's definitely true that there are some clear differences in brain structure and complexity between humans and animals. We don't have the largest brains. The sperm whale and the elephant brain are larger, weighing up to 10 kilos compared with the humble 1.35 kilos of the human brain. But humans have by far the largest ratio of brain weight to body weight. We have the most developed cerebral cortex, which is the curly bits on the outside, comprising 80% of the brain mass. And we have the highest neuronal density, totaling 100 billion neurons. Clearly, the human brain is significant and extraordinary. It comprises 2% of our body's weight, but uses 25% of its energy, which is why you're always hungry and you're working hard. Great if it was a weight loss method, wouldn't it? But anyway. And 82% of all human genes, extraordinary facts, are expressed in the brain. And has already been said, I spent over a decade studying it using functional MRI. Clearly, the brain is extraordinary, and in many ways, our brains are unique compared to other creatures. But the question we want to look at this evening is the brain alone enough to account for human consciousness and therefore human uniqueness? Is the brain on its own the whole story as to why we are unique? And of course, many brilliant scientists do seem to think so. For example, the late Professor Sir Colin Blakemore, Emeritus Professor of Neuroscience at Oxford University and a Royal Society Fellow, said that the human brain is a machine which alone accounts for all of our actions, our most private thoughts, our beliefs. All our actions are the products of the activity of our brains. Or we could look at the Harvard psychologist Steven Pinker, who in an article in Time magazine in 2007 said that consciousness does not reside in an ethereal soul that uses the brain. Consciousness is the activity of the brain. Scientists have amassed evidence that every aspect of consciousness can be tied to the brain. And of course, this question doesn't just relate to our biological past, it also relates to our silicon-based future. If human consciousness is purely material, is accountable entirely by the physical workings of the brain, then in theory, one day it could be generated artificially. And of course, the field of AI is changing and moving exponentially. In the last 2 years, we've had the arrival of large language models of AI, such as ChatGPT, and it increasingly feels like we're interacting with a person rather than with a set of algorithms. The Turing test, developed by Alan Turing in the 1950s to assess the intelligence of an algorithm, is being smashed again and again and again. And so the question is, will human levels of consciousness eventually be possible in machines? Now, in answer or in response to this question, the philosopher John Searle developed a thought experiment known as the Chinese room, which he used to argue that just because an algorithm is passing the Turing test and appears to be conscious, that doesn't necessarily mean that it is conscious. And he asks us to imagine the following scenario. Imagine a person outside a room, person A, passing Chinese messages to another person inside a closed room. Now, the person inside the room has no knowledge of the Chinese language. All they have is a book of Chinese symbols to decode their message and to send a reply. Now, to the person outside the room, it seems like the person inside speaks Chinese. But that is actually incorrect. All they can do is process Chinese characters. And Searle's point is that the ability to process information, however accurate, however sophisticated it may have become, even in recent months, that is not the same thing as having a conscious self, an inner life, an inner reality. And this is true even if the algorithm is pulling from large data sets and is outputting responses that it hasn't been programmed explicitly to do by a human being. Even in the presence of machine learning, the same is still true. Artificial intelligence and human consciousness are two very different things. And I think one of our biggest challenges going forwards will be discerning between something that genuinely is conscious and something that has the very subtle appearance of human consciousness. So that brings us back to our question, is human consciousness, this quality that makes us most different from other creatures, just a product of the brain? And this is known broadly as the mind-brain problem. And it struck me that it's probably a good idea to define really what we mean in this whole conversation. There are a few different terms that are used and that float around. Perhaps we're all kind of clear what we mean by the brain. We mean the thing inside of our skulls that we hope is there and brain imaging tells us is there. All of the physics and chemistry to do with the organ inside of our skulls. The neurons, the neurotransmitters, the hormones, the chemicals, the electrical and chemical activity. But then we also have a mind, which involves all of our thoughts and feelings and emotions and memories. And part of the reason you're not just a brain, by the way, is because you also have a mind. And often, well, we'll get into this, but often we talk about the brain and we actually mean the mind. And then there's consciousness, and there's a lot of overlap between what we mean by mind and what we mean by conscious awareness. Consciousness essentially being the fact that there's something that it is to be you. You have an inner self, a sense of self, if you like, reflexive self-awareness. And then people talk about soul, and soul is a slippery subject. It's a slippery concept, and what you mean by soul depends who you ask. We're probably not going to be able to get into that quite so much in the lecture, but One person that has done a lot of thinking on it, Dallas Willard, talks about it being a coordinating principle that integrates all the components of a person, into one life. Actually, soul is very holistic. It's not this immaterial part of you that floats off. But of course, that's a whole conversation there as well. Now, mind, soul, and consciousness, for the purposes of this conversation, can be thought of as overlapping in terms of how do they relate to the brain. Some might say that consciousness is a property of the mind. Some might say that the mind is a property of the soul. It depends who you ask, is the take-home message. But you have a brain, and you also have a mind. A conscious mind. And the question is, what is the relationship between those two things? Can non-conscious neurons generate conscious humans? And that is really what's at the heart of what we're thinking about, the mind-brain problem. How do you get from brain cells to thoughts? How do you get from the chemicals inside your head to what it's like to be you? Is it even possible? How do you get from non-conscious neurons to conscious you? And the thing that it's helpful to know is this is not a new question. Sometimes it can seem like the rise of neuroscience and the rise of AI has forced this question into the foreground, and philosophers and theologians are scrabbling around for answers to this. But this has been debated since the ancient world. It's not a new question, and hopefully you'll see that there are lots of different views out there. One philosopher, David Chalmers, who's based at NYU, has named it the hard problem of consciousness. How does the physical brain give rise to conscious experience? And the perspective that drives the view that you are just your brain is essentially saying that mind and brain are the same thing, that mental states are reducible to physics and chemistry in the brain. And that's why it's referred to as reductive physicalism. The mind is the brain. Now, this view actually has some very significant implications, not just for the neuroscientist and philosopher, but actually for everyday life, implications for all of us. Because if that's true, if we are just entirely driven by the neurons in our brains, then every thought that we have, every opinion that we express, and every decision we make is not actually coming from us. It's coming from forces beyond our control inside of our skull. And if that is true, then what do our thoughts and opinions even mean if they're not ours, if they're actually the forces of nature, albeit on a small scale? And if that is true, how can we be held morally responsible for the decisions and actions that flow from those things? There are significant implications of this view. And yet we seem to live as though people are the bearer of their opinions and choices and actions, rather than simply being at the mercy of their brains. We name authors on papers because they wrote the paper, not their brain. We award degrees because students sat the exams, not their brains. And we convict criminals on the basis that they did have some degree of choice in what they did. And so we seem to live as though we're more than just our brains in every area of life. And so surely the brain can't be the whole story. We also know this because the hundreds of thousands of molecules within every neuron are replaced many thousands of times in a lifetime. And yet our sense of self, on the whole, remains continuous over time. That's another thing that's unique about it, that the you that is here tomorrow is the same as the you that was here yesterday. It's the same you. And yet your brain is being replaced and changed and renewed And of course, then there's quantum physics. And quantum physicists remind us that we don't even know what matter is, let alone rely upon it entirely to explain something as complex as human consciousness. The closer we get to the atom, the more indistinct it becomes. And it turns out matter is just as mystifying as consciousness itself. You know, what the science shows us, and I learned this too well as a brain imaging scientist, is that mind and brain are connected. If you put someone in an MRI scanner and you give them an activity that uses their mind, a mental task like working memory, like remember these things and tell them back to me, you will see brain networks lighting up. Clearly, mind and brain, mental states and brain states are connected. But just because they are connected does not necessarily mean they are synonymous or identical, or that one cancels out the other and renders it irrelevant. The science merely gets you to connection. Any further deduction is taking you into the realm of philosophy, and I'll say a bit more about that in a bit. But let me try and say a bit more about why this is the case. I don't know if you're into coffee. I'm into coffee. Imagine that we live in a purely material universe and all we have at our disposal are the forces of nature acting on matter. Describe to me the smell of coffee. Now, you might offer me the chemical structure of the volatile compounds in coffee, and that'd be brilliant. And I loved organic chemistry, and that would be elegant and beautiful. But would it get me any closer to the smell of coffee? It wouldn't. Or you might offer me the physiology as you drink the coffee and digest it. But that actually wouldn't get me any closer to the smell of coffee. It wouldn't get me any closer to the taste of coffee either. It's merely telling you the chemical process is taking place in your body. If you want to understand the smell of coffee or the taste, you have to smell it, you have to taste it. And this is an example of a quale in its singular, or qualia in the plural. And qualia is a term that philosophers use to describe qualitative experiences that are impossible to describe physically. There is no physical way of capturing it. And arguably, the biggest qualia of all is the experience of what it is to be you. And imagine we did an experiment to try and find out what it's like for you to go through your next audit at work or set of exams. And we attach an EEG cap to you, and we're measuring 24/7 electrical signal from within your brain delivered to your scalp. We might put you in an MRI scanner and collect some structural scans, and also do some functional imaging as well, and get a sense of activity at different times. Will that tell us what it's like for you to go through your next audit at work, or revise and go through your next set of exams? It won't. It will measure some beautiful and elegant things from your brain. But if we want to access what it's like to be you, we need to ask you. We can measure your brain till the cows come home. If we want to know what's in your mind, you have to choose to make that known to us. And for this reason, there are many philosophers, atheists, and agnostics, as well as Christian theists, that make the case that mind and brain are two very different things. It is not a done deal to say the mind is the brain, end of story, full stop. These are two very different things. And there are other ways of looking at the mind-brain relationship that I unpack in my book, Am I Just My Brain? And that I will have a whistle-stop tour through now before we move on to clinical perspectives. So one perspective is to say that the mind emerges from the brain. This is a little bit different. It's still saying that the brain is all that's needed, but somehow when a number of brain parts come together, something new comes into being that is greater than the sum of its original building blocks. Something new emerges that can't be reduced to physics and chemistry, and yet still is tied to the brain. And this is referred to as non-reductive physicalism. A little bit like maybe a film has a number of building blocks. It has a cast, it has a director, it has a soundtrack, it has a film crew, and so on. But when you watch the film, all those building blocks are necessary, but when you watch it, you're actually not thinking about the building blocks, you're experiencing the film as a whole. And yet, if you remove any one of those building blocks, the film wouldn't be what it is. That's a little bit like what this view is trying to say. And it's trying to make sense of the fact that in science, mind and brain do seem to be very closely connected. So we still need some holistic way of thinking about it. But the challenge of this view, and every view has its challenges, is this: how exactly does the brain generate the mind? Just because you put the word generate there or emerge doesn't change the nature of the hard problem. How do non-conscious neurons generate consciousness? You still have an impossible chasm to cross unless we're not simply in a closed system of the forces of nature acting on matter. Of course, many appeal to neuronal complexity, which is definitely part of it, I would say, but even this alone doesn't seem to be enough to explain consciousness. Ian McGilchrist, in his book The Matter with Things, compares the cerebral cortex, the parts of the brain known to most closely correlate with consciousness, and the cerebellum, which is the kind of cauliflower thing sitting at the back of your brain. You know, the cerebellum is much more complex than the cerebral cortex, and yet it is not capable of supporting self-awareness. And so, in reality, neurobiological complexity alone doesn't seem to be enough to explain conscious states. Moving on, another view is to say that the mind is beyond the brain. This view says there are two kinds of substances, that the mind is a non-physical substance and the brain is a physical substance, and these two things interact very closely, but they are distinct, and it's referred to as substance dualism, two substances, traceable to the ancient world, voiced by René Descartes in various ways, is held by a number of philosophers and scientists today who defend things like free will on the basis of there being a mind that is distinct and can bring about causal change in the brain and body. For example, J.P. Moreland would say that the brain is a physical substance that has physical properties, and the mind or soul is a mental substance that has mental properties. The soul and brain can interact with each other, but they are different substances with different properties. Or we could look at the renowned neurosurgeon Wilder Penfield, who founded the Montreal Neurological Institute, known for his treatment of patients with epilepsy, trying to isolate the area of dysfunctional electrical activity, and in doing so ended up mapping the human cortex. After many decades of doing this, he reflected, for my own part, after years of striving to explain the mind on the basis of brain action alone, I've come to the conclusion that it's simpler and far easier to be logical if one adopts the hypothesis that our being does consist of two fundamental elements. It can be an unpopular position to believe that there is something such as a non-physical mind. I think one of the challenges that this view faces is, what does that even mean? And what does it even mean that if a non-physical mind interacts with a physical brain? And why would there be two things when the sciences seem to make them seem so integrated? The science makes it seem like there's one thing. So why are there two? So that view has its challenges. And then finally, a very interesting and view that's growing in popularity is known as panpsychism. And this comes from the Greek pan meaning all and psyche meaning soul, and essentially says, look, we haven't got very far starting with physical brain building blocks and trying to build a bridge to consciousness. Why don't we flip that on its head and assume that consciousness is fundamental to the universe and make a case for solving the hard problem that way? And this view says that there are levels of consciousness in every living thing, right from the atomic scale through to all living organisms, animals, and then up to humans. As David Chalmers put it, a theory of consciousness should take experience as fundamental and construct a theory of experience. And so according to panpsychists, there's something that it is like to be an electron or a tree as well as a chimpanzee. But more complex systems possess higher levels. But even electrons and quarks, according to Philip Goff of Durham University, have unimaginably simple forms of experience. And this view is fascinating. I think that it helps us to reframe the question in ways that might help us make more progress, to connect conscious states to matter in new ways. But the challenge for the panpsychist is about the topic that we're discussing this evening. How do we explain the vastly different levels of consciousness that human beings seem to have, even compared with advanced primates? So by way of summary, over the last few minutes, I've presented a number of different ways of looking at the relationship between the mind and the brain. I've presented two views that argue that brain biology can account for human consciousness, and two arguing that brain biology on its own is not enough to account for human consciousness. And hopefully what you're seeing is that people of all faiths and none believe different things. This is not a foregone conclusion. There are people in all different camps. And the important thing to stress here is that these are all philosophical positions. These are not scientific positions. There actually is no scientific study you can conduct that will enable you to identify which of these it is. And in fact, there are many, many others, and philosophers love to slice up the pie lots of different ways. I've kind of summarized a vast area. But the science can only get you to connection. These are all empirically neutral. And any philosophical view that we hold is something that goes beyond what science can tell us. So I want to move on now in the lecture to think about clinical neuroscience. What does clinical neuroscience bring to this whole conversation? Well, most of the time, we see that conscious states and brain states are closely correlated. There seems to be a continuity, as we would expect, between brain states and conscious states. For example, in the brain of the unborn and the newborn baby, as they develop, they grow in conscious awareness, and that goes into infant and child development as well. We see in brain injury that this can have a significant impact on the conscious states of the person, depending on the injury. And then we see it in disease states like Alzheimer's and dementia, that as the brain degenerates, that the person's conscious mind also deteriorates. But there are also some instances of discontinuity between conscious states and brain states, creating a bit more of a complex picture. For example, there are some adults walking this earth that are missing 95% of their brain tissue. They have survived childhood hydrocephaly, water on the brain, and yet they are normal functioning adults. And these are some scans of what their brains look like. Now, of course, we could make, I'm sure that neurologists will make a case for neuronal efficiency and being able to sort of regroup and so on. But even so, it's a lot of brain tissue to be missing and still be functioning. And it just, there's a bit more of a complex picture. We could also look at near-death experiences. When the brain dies, what happens to the mind? Now, this is, for some, a controversial data set. But there are a significant number of patients who have been resuscitated after cardiac arrest or surgery, who have claimed to be vividly conscious even while physiologically dead, and who've been declared dead by a clinician. There are 50 years of data now since resuscitation capabilities arose in the 1970s. And so it's fascinating. There are journals, there are committees, that it's, there are systematic studies in the US, the UK, the Netherlands, and so on by cardiologists, psychiatrists, and so on. And there are some who have changed their views based on their own conscious experience. One such person is former Harvard neurosurgeon, Dr. Eben Alexander, who developed a severe bacterial meningitis at the age of 54. He ended up in a coma for 7 days. He wasn't expected to survive. All the areas of his neocortex known to correlate with consciousness had entirely shut down. His family were told to put their affairs in order. But extraordinarily, he made a full recovery, and he recounted an extremely vivid conscious experience. He said, "Mine was in some ways a perfect storm of near-death experiences. As a practicing neurosurgeon with decades of research and hands-on work in the operating room behind me, I was in a better than average position to judge not only the reality, but also the implications of what happened to me. Those implications are tremendous beyond description. My experience showed me that the death of the body and the brain are not the end of consciousness, that human experience continues beyond the grave." Now, it's hard to know what to make of this kind of data. Perhaps at the very least, we see when we look at actual people, when we move the conversation out of the lecture theatre and into the operating theatre, we see that people are complex, that human consciousness is complex and its relationship to the brain. And even one genuine example of one of these, and there are other clinical instances I could tell you about, it gives us pause for thought in light of the view that we are merely just our brains, that the brain alone can account for human consciousness and therefore human uniqueness. And we could ask, what is the simplest explanation that makes sense of the complexity? Michael Egnor, professor of neurosurgery at Stony Brook University School of Medicine, says that materialism, the view that matter is all that exists, is the premise of much contemporary thinking about what a human being is. And yet evidence from the laboratory, the operating room, and clinical experience points to a less fashionable conclusion that human beings straddle the material and immaterial realms. How about theological perspectives as we draw to a close? When we look at theological perspectives on what human beings are, we also see a picture of complexity. We see a picture that agrees with the science, actually, that human beings are complex. Some verses that are not a scientific account of human formation, they're doing different things to that, but they say, "Then the Lord God formed a man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being." Here we see that human beings, according to theological perspectives, according to these verses in Genesis, are both physical and spiritual. We are physically and spiritually integrated beings. We have a non-physical spiritual dimension that is very much integrated with the physical, not some weird element that has nothing to do with everything, but that is integrated. And this actually helps us make sense of areas like neurotheology, which is the intersection of neuroscience and theology, where people have studied what is happening in the brain when people engage in religious practices, spiritual practices. And yes, the brain lights up. We see networks in the brain lit up, but that's not a reason to begin to question whether the experience was authentic or whether indeed God exists. It actually simply points to the fact that we're integrated physical and spiritual beings. Actually, that's exactly what we should expect that there's representation in the brain, even for religious and spiritual practice and engagement. Now, as I close, I just want to finish with a different question that actually relates to the whole thing, because there are some questions, even if we end up with a very elegant neuroscience of consciousness, there are still some questions that science can't answer and was arguably never intended to answer. Questions like the one I found myself asking as a child sitting by the window on a rainy day. Why can I think in the first place? Why can we think at all? Why are we conscious beings? And what is the most persuasive explanation for why we find ourselves in this universe as conscious beings? And I have asked the question, if God exists, does that help us? Well, in a materialist universe, you can argue that human consciousness is not impossible, but it's an anomaly, because we live in a non-conscious universe of time plus matter plus chance, and somehow conscious humans have arisen from within that non-conscious universe. And that's not impossible, but it's surprising. And yet, if God exists, then we didn't actually start with matter, but with mind. We started with the mind of God, and then through God, all things were made, including human beings and their brains. You see, implicit to those verses in Genesis that I read was the reality that God existed before human beings were made. And therefore, if this is true, then we've lived in a conscious universe all along. And if this is true, then our minds, our imprints, they are reflections of the mind of God. Why can we think? We can think because God thinks. We have a mind because God has a mind. We are conscious because we are made by a conscious community of Father and Son and Holy Spirit, which actually is also helpful because it means that to use the mind is actually indeed in line with what it means to be made by God. And so, in other words, we could argue, a case can be made that the existence of the conscious mind, the thing that makes us unique as human beings, that is natural to theism, but it is unnatural to materialism. And so arguably the very existence of the conscious mind makes more sense if God exists than if he doesn't, which is why George Wald, Nobel laureate in physiology and medicine, said this: mind, rather than emerging as a late outgrowth in the evolution of life, has existed always as the matrix, the source and condition of physical reality. That the stuff of which physical reality is constructed is mind stuff. It is mind that has composed a physical universe. And so, in conclusion, are human beings unique? Well, a strong case can be made that they are. But the source of our uniqueness, I argue, is found not just by looking within and to the evolutionary past, but by looking upwards and to the beginning of all things, to God himself. And the use of the mind in pursuit of knowledge, in creating art, in developing technology, and much more. These are all an outworking of what it means to be made by a divine mind, a God of love, beauty, and creativity, who has made humanity with his imprint for a life of love, beauty, and creativity. Thank you for listening.
I'd now like to invite Professor John Sawkins. He's our Associate Principal for Scottish Borders campus at the moment, to come and give a short reply on behalf of the university.
Thank you for that, Jane. It's my really very great pleasure on behalf of everyone here in the hall to offer Sharon our sincere thanks for helping us explore once again the interface of religion and science, looking at the question of whether or not humans are unique. The chaplaincy lecture gives us time and space to reflect on some of the most fundamental issues of life, not just issues of what and how, but who and why. And so, Sharon, thank you for helping me reflect on not just what I am and how I am, but who I am and why I am. Does it mean to be human? These are really big ticket items for us that require that clear thinking and a commitment to follow through in the search for truth where the science and the thinking leads. What stood out for me was the idea of, I think, where we start and where we end. Do we start and end with the mind, or do we start and end with the matter? If we start and end with the mind, we become, I think, deaf to the insights of science. If we start and end in the matter, we then become deaf to the insights of religion. And somehow, I think, we need to work from both ends at the same time, and to hold science and religion side by side, and to learn from them both in this search for truth. So thank you for helping us to wrestle with that, and I hope all of us in the room have found it helpful in framing the way we think about the world, and as a useful means of responding to this sort of innate human impulse that we have to search for new truth, what we might call research, an impulse which, of course, higher education is there to foster and support and grow. Sharon, I think I speak for us all when I say you have offered us much to think about, to reflect on, and to work through. Please accept our thanks for all that you have shared with us in the last hour. And now I invite us all to show our appreciation to Sharon in the usual way.